All right, so welcome to today's event. Today is the book launch of Dr. Ada Agada's book. Today we have very interesting scholars who will be discussing his work, who will be reviewing this book, this groundbreaking book that Dr. Agada has published. The title of the book is Consolationism and Comparative African Philosophy Beyond Universalism and Particularism. But before I begin to talk about the book, let me talk a bit about the author of the book, Dr. Ada Agada. Dr. Agada received his PhD from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. He has taught African philosophy and intercultural philosophy classes in polytechnics and universities in Nigeria and Germany. Dr. Agada is the recipient of the research grants and fellowship from the John Templeton Foundation and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. He has also received fellowships from the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, JIS, and the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS. He has published widely in reputable national and international journals in the field of African philosophy, with specific focus in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and intercultural philosophy. His first book, titled Existence and Consolation, Reinventing Ontology, Noxes, and Values in African Philosophy, has been praised by African and Western philosophers for its originality. And in fact, it was named a 2015 Outstanding Academic Title Award winner by Choice, the magazine of the Association of College and Research Libraries, the largest division of the American Library Association. So primarily a researcher in the field of African philosophy, Dr. Agada is interested in the exploration of convergences and divergences in African, Western, and Asian philosophical concepts. He is currently a senior researcher at the Conversational Society of Philosophy and a researcher at the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, the University of Fort Hare. That is a brief overview, a brief bio of Dr. Ada Agada. Now, his first book, which won the Choice OET Award, is the foundation for this new book that we are going to be reviewing today. And I'll just say a little bit about this new book. It is a major challenge to African philosophy. This book demonstrates the importance of the universalization question for every committed African philosopher. Rooted in Africa's colonial legacy, the universalization question challenges the African thinker to show how authentically African philosophical concepts and phenomena can be universally applicable in a globalizing world. In this original book, the author sets the philosophy of consolationism into African philosophical discourse, constructing a unique philosophical system that is at once Western and universally relevant. The book engages major African and Western philosophers of diverse ideological leanings in a compelling dialogue that announces the future of world philosophy as one of interculturality, in which a common philosophical horizon is fought out of the cultural diversities of the world for edification of humanity in a continually changing world. This book is an important read for researchers in the field of African studies, intercultural philosophy, philosophy of mind, and existentialism. This is just a brief overview of Dr. Agada's book and the person, Dr. Ada Agada. And today we are going to be, hearing from very eminent scholars, their own rights, who will be reviewing and discussing this book today, this important work in African philosophy. And so today we are going to be having Professor Bryan van Norden, who is going to be our book reviewer. And we are also going to be having Dr. Motsamai Molefe, who is going to be a discussant, and also Mr. Emmanuel Ofuasia is also going to be a discussant. So very soon I will invite Professor Bryan to just give us his review of Ada's book. But before we do that, I would also like to introduce Professor Bryan. So Professor Bryan is a James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College in the United States of America, and chair professor in philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University, China. Professor Van Norden has published 10 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy, too numerous to mention. He has also written a TED-Ed video on Confucius that has up to or even more than 1 million views. Professor Van Norden has published a number of essays as a public intellectual, including Confucius on Gay Marriage, If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is. He has also written The Ignorant Do Not Have a Right to an Audience, and he has written Was this ancient Taoist the first philosopher of disability, co-authored with John Altman. His books and articles have been translated into various languages, including Arabic, Chinese, Danish, Estonian, German, Korean, Portuguese, and so on and so forth. He is a recipient of Fulbright Fellowship, National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and Andrew Mellon Fellowships. Professor Van Norden has been honored as one of the best 300 professors in the US by the Princeton Review. From 2017 to 2020, Professor Van Norden was Pham In Thom Hu Cho Temple Professor at Yale NUS College in Singapore. His hobbies include poker. He has played in the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, and he's also into video games, which I also am into video games, which is interesting. So, Professor Van Norden, I'll welcome you to give your book review on Dr. Agada's groundbreaking philosophical work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to that praise, but I will do my best. I first met Professor Ada Agada at a talk he gave in South Africa in February of 2019, and I was immediately struck by what a vibrant and fascinating philosopher he is. Now, at first glance, it might seem that Professor Agada and I have very little in common professionally. He is a distinguished scholar of African philosophy, while I research Chinese philosophy. However, African and Chinese philosophy have had similar fates. As Peter K.J. Park points out in this seminal book, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon from 1780 to 1830, there were three common views among Europeans in the 18th century about the origin of philosophy. One view was that philosophy originated in Africa and was imported into ancient Greece from Africa. This is indeed suggested by the dialogues of Plato. Another view was that philosophy originated in South Asia and from there came to ancient Greece. This would help explain some of the similarities between Pythagorean and Platonic views on reincarnation and views found in Indian philosophy, for example. Now, I'm sure you can guess what the third common view among Europeans on the origin of philosophy was in the 18th century. Well, it's a trick question. The third theory prevalent among Europeans in the 18th century was that philosophy originated independently in both Africa and South Asia, and both cultures gave philosophy to ancient Greece. Yes, the view that philosophy originated independently and only once in history in ancient Greece was an idiosyncratic view in early modern Europe. In addition, when Jesuit missionaries who received extensive exposure to European philosophy as part of their training first encountered Chinese thinkers like Confucius and Mengzi in the 17th century, they immediately recognized them as fellow philosophers. Indeed, the first translation of the Analects, the sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples, into a European language was the Jesuits' Latin translation, Confucius Sonorum Philosophus, whose title means Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. Nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, and I should add that when mainstream European philosophers like Leibniz, who's still on the curriculum of any mainstream Western philosophy department, encountered Chinese philosophy, Leibniz had nothing but praise for the high quality of Chinese philosophy, and also argued that the I Ching, the classic of changes, independently had developed binary arithmetic, which Leibniz himself also discovered independently, and which of course became the basis for computer science and computer technology. Nonetheless, as Park shows, by the end of the 19th century, African, South Asian, East Asian, and indigenous American philosophy, sometimes called American Indian philosophy, had been largely banished from the European philosophical curriculum. Why? Well, Anglo-European economic imperialism required a rationalization, and this led to the rise of pseudo-scientific racism. Sadly, Immanuel Kant was a major figure in providing this rationalization. In his lectures, Kant asserted that only the Caucasian race is capable of doing philosophy. And I apologize for even reading the horrible things that Kant said, but sometimes we have to face what people said in order to understand its influence and to overcome it. So these are translations from Kant's Anthropological Lectures, and Mark Larimore published an article in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy in 1999 that I can give you a reference to that translates these passages. Kant writes, quote, "The race of the whites contains all talents and motives in itself." And then he hierarchically arranges other races beneath the whites and claims that, again, and I apologize, but I'm quoting him, "The Hindus," Kant writes, "have a strong degree of calm and all look like philosophers. That notwithstanding, they are much inclined to anger and love. They thus are educable in the highest degree, but only to the arts and not to the sciences. They will never achieve abstract concepts." Next, and again, I apologize for saying this, but I'm just quoting Kant so we can recognize what he'd done. "The race of Negroes is full of affect and passion, very lively, chatty, and vain. It can be educated, but only to the education of servants, i.e. they can be trained." And then he says, "The indigenous American people are uneducable, for they lack affect and passion. They are not amorous, and so are not fertile. They speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy." Kant ranked people in East Asia at the same level as people in South Asia. And in another context, and there's a good article by Julia Ching about this, Chinese Ethics and Kant in Philosophy East and West from 1978, he says, "Philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient. Their teacher Confucius teaches in his writings nothing outside a moral doctrine designed for the princes and offers examples of former Chinese princes. But a concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese." Now, as Peter K.J. Park explains, Kant didn't originate this kind of pseudo-scientific racism, but because of his influence as a philosopher, he helped popularize it. And Kant's later followers rewrote the philosophy textbooks to make it appear that philosophy began in ancient Greece and only in ancient Greece, and reached its inevitable culmination in Kant's transcendental idealism. Now, most philosophers, I think, in the Anglo-European world today would reject the explicit racism of Kant and his followers. However, not all of them would. I would recommend that people look at the article published in the New York Times online in 2018 by Professor Anita Allen of the University of Pennsylvania, The Pain and Promise of Black Women in Philosophy, where she illustrates some of the outrageous racism that's been shown by contemporary philosophers in the United States. But I do think that most contemporary Anglo-European philosophers would reject Kant's explicit racism. However, the legacy of Kant survives in the a priori assumption most contemporary Anglo-European philosophers make that there never was any philosophy outside the tradition that goes back to Greece and Rome. Indeed, as Professor Agada and I know all too well, many philosophers not only make this assumption that there was never any philosophy outside of the tradition that goes back to Greece and Rome, but they defend it passionately, even when confronted with philosophers like ourselves, who are happy to provide examples of philosophy outside the Anglo-European canon. Like, for example, Zara Jacob in the African tradition, or Mengzi or Zhuangzi in the Chinese tradition. Another problem faced by scholars like Professor Agada is answering the double bind as described by Professor Robert Bernasconi. Bernasconi writes, either African philosophy is so similar to Western philosophy that it makes no distinctive contribution and effectively disappears, or it's so different that its credentials to be genuine philosophy will always be in doubt. Amy Oldberding spoke for many of us when she borrowed the same expression to describe the paradox that confronts those of us who study Chinese philosophy. She said, quote, the double bind for scholars who would promote interest in non-Western traditions, then, can register as an importunate, impossible demand. Show us something we have not seen before, but be sure it looks well and truly familiar to us too. There is reason why Bernasconi, Olberding, and others mark a distinction between Western and non-Western philosophies. But this is not an entirely satisfactory division for our purposes, since, for example, African American, Islamic, and Latin American philosophy are all neglected by the mainstream Western canon, but each is deeply influenced by the tradition that goes back to ancient Greece. Consequently, I have proposed the label, the less commonly taught philosophies, as a handy designation for this heterogeneous group, which includes, among others, Africana philosophy, East Asian philosophy, Indigenous American philosophy, and South Asian philosophy. And if you'll forgive a moment of self-promotion, I talk about these issues in this book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto. And the phrase less commonly taught philosophies, I actually borrowed from my colleagues in language instruction. The phrase less commonly taught languages is used by the Modern Language Association in the United States to identify historically distinct but equally neglected languages, including Arabic, Swahili, and Vietnamese. So I use a similar term to describe the less commonly taught philosophies, which are not by any means identical or part of one tradition, but have in common the fact that they've been excluded from the mainstream canon. Now, Africana philosophy, as opposed to African philosophy, is a sometimes useful label that includes indigenous African philosophy, both pre and post-colonial traditions, and the philosophical thought of the African diaspora, like the African American philosophical tradition. Professor Agada's book focuses on modern African philosophy, particularly, he says, the tradition of philosophical thought that emerged fully in the first half of the 20th century. One of the great issues that occupies this period is the debate over ethnophilosophy. A classic work of ethnophilosophy is La Philosophie Bantu, from 1945, translated into English and available on the internet under the title Bantu Philosophy, first translated in 1959 by Placide Tempels. Tempels claims that there is, quote, an ontology that penetrates and informs all the thought of the Bantu people. It dominates and orientates all their behavior. This ontology is never made explicit, but it's implicit in and can be recovered from, he says, a comparative study of the languages, modes of behavior, institutions, and customs of the Bantu. Tempels claim that this implicit ontology of the Bantu was based on a dynamic vital force, in contrast with Western philosophy, which is based on a static notion of being, with a capital B. Ironically, the term ethnophilosophy first gained prominence when used pejoratively by the great African philosopher Paul Huntonji, who dismissed what he called Tempel's naivete for confusing doing philosophy with doing ethnophilosophy. I had the honor of hearing Professor Huntonji speak on the same trip to South Africa where I met Professor Agada. Among the concerns raised by critics of ethnophilosophy, like Huntonji and Kwasi Wiredu, are the following. They worry, does ethnophilosophy attribute an illusory unanimity to African thinkers? Do all Bantu, much less all Africans, really think this way? They worry that ethnophilosophy gives the usually white ethnologist the privilege of speaking on behalf of the African. And they worry that the resulting ethnophilosophy lacks the analytic precision and argumentative rigor that are taken as hallmarks of real philosophy by contemporary academic philosophers in the West. A closely related but not identical dispute in modern African philosophy is over particularism as opposed to universalism. In other words, to what extent should African philosophy be rooted in particular African cultures and their beliefs? And to what extent should Africans aspire to be participants in the allegedly cosmopolitan world of contemporary Anglo-American philosophy? In other words, is there a distinctively African philosophy, or is there simply philosophy done by Africans? Certainly, one way of understanding ethnophilosophy is as a radical form of particularism. Ethnophilosophy could be understood as a form of philosophy that originates in Africa and speaks only to those Africans who already share its commitments. However, part of the power of Professor Agada's approach is that he explores a way to transcend the dilemma of particularism and universalism and preserve what is valuable in ethnophilosophy while adopting a critical stance that goes beyond just making explicit a culture's pre-existing beliefs. Professor Agada's label for his own philosophy is consolationism, a unique and original system grounded in concepts taken from the particularities of ethnophilosophy, but going beyond them to offer an ambitious philosophical synthesis with universal appeal. Consolationism begins with the observation that human agency is teleological, in the sense that our actions are not only goal-directed, but require ultimate goals like perfection. However, our experience of the world makes us realize that perfection cannot be realized. Consequently, human life is ultimately tragic. We are drawn to realize the goal of perfection, but we know that we will never achieve it. This realization might lead us to despair, but Professor Agada suggests instead that our goal should be consolation. I think I understand what Professor Agada means by consolation. I take him to mean by consolation, taking joy in one's limited but genuine role in the unending process of striving for perfection. but I would be interested to hear whether Professor Agada believes I have correctly described what he thinks of as consolation. Now, if you have questions or objections regarding the worldview I've just sketched, I urge you to just read Professor Agada's profound and fecund philosophical system in detail. Whether you are ultimately convinced or not, and how seldom does one philosopher truly convince another of anything, to do that would be to achieve perfection in this world. And as Professor Agada points out, that is something that is beyond us. Whether this happens or not, you will learn a great deal from this book about modern African philosophy and the many figures in the Anglo-European philosophical tradition that Professor Agada engages in a profound and fascinating way. I heartily recommend this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bryan, for your very nice, very interesting talk. That was wonderful, and I'm sure many of us learned a lot from what you said, about the history of racism in relation to African philosophy, how African philosophy tries to transcend ethno-philosophy, and the role Ada's book, Dr. Agada's book, plays in current discussions regarding how to transcend the particularism and universalism debates, and how consolation figures into that understanding. So thank you very much for that very interesting talk. So I will call on our next speaker, next discussant. I'll be calling on Mr. Emmanuel Ofuasia. But before I do that, let me just say a little bit about Emmanuel. Emmanuel Ofuasia is a doctoral research student in the philosophy department at the Lagos State University, Nigeria, since 2018. In 2012, Emmanuel Ofuasia bagged the first class honors in philosophy at Lagos State University. In 2015, he got his Masters of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Lagos, Nigeria. Ofuasia has emerged as a recipient of local and international academic recognition, awards, grants, and so on for his outstanding scholarship. In 2013, for instance, he was awarded D.K. Olukoya grant titled Academic Award of Excellence. In 2021, he received funding for research on African philosophy of religion from the Global Philosophy of Religion Project, University of Birmingham, sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. In 2022, he received another funding from the Culture and Animal Foundation to investigate the relevance of animal sacrifice in traditional African religion. To his credit, Emmanuel Ofuasia has almost 40 local international publications in the form of books, chapters in books, journal articles, and book reviews, and what have you. His areas of research competence are process relational metaphysics, African ontology, African logic, studies in mysticism, especially from the Yoruba philosophical tradition, spiritual philosophies, and the history and philosophy of physics. At the moment, his doctoral research is focused on the process relational and logic foundation of African ontology. Please let's welcome Mr. Ofuasia to give his talk on Dr. Agada's book. Mr. Ofuasia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aribia. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for inviting me to be one of the discussants over Dr. Agada's very thoughtful and original work. I must commence with the understanding that the book that we are reviewing today, Consolationism and Comparative Philosophy, Beyond Universalism and Particularism, is a follow-up from Agada's previous work, Existence and Consolation. And I must begin by saying that this work is much easier to follow vis-a-vis the one of 2015. And one thing continued to make itself clear, which is that the work is a testament to the originality and uniqueness of Ada Agada's ability to reason independently as a scholar. There are so many areas of the book. I haven't gone through both the first one and the second one we are reviewing today that I find very, very useful for contemporary scholarship on African philosophy. And there are also some fallouts that I thought the book would have been able to address, following the fact that by we, I mean myself and some of my colleagues and friends of the Conversational Society of Philosophy, an emergent group of scholars that are devoted to the study of African philosophy and studies. As we have shown, we have had so many arguments on this book, and I thought personally that some of the points raised would have been addressed by Ada Agada in this book. And I am going to make these problems that I find in the book very obvious, such that it's able to quell that penchant, that stigma among some persons, non-CSP members, who believe that members of the CSP do nothing but praise one another's research and do not do any kind of critical efforts towards improving each of their ideas. So I'm going to, first of all, begin with some of the commendable aspects of Ada Agada's work, and then I proceed to show some of the fallouts that I find in the work. As Professor Van Norden has already shown, the main inner kernel of the doctrine of mood by Ada Agada as a philosopher is not in question. And the central idea of Ada Agada that I find in his ontology is a doctrine of mood. And when Ada Agada talks about mood, he says this mood is primordial, and it is a proto-mind, which means that it is something that comes before any other thing in the world. By mood, Ada Agada means something that is primordial even to God. So God is subordinate to mood. You know, in many metaphysical systems, there is this ultimate category where you also always put God as the ultimate category. But in Agada's system, God is not the ultimate category. God is a tool that is being used by the idea of mood in actualizing and actualizing what we have in the actual world. Now, if that is the case, we should ask ourselves, how does Agada transcend the view of Western scholars such as Martin Heidegger, who, after wrestling with the idea of being in the history of Western thought, came to the conclusion that metaphysics has ended? And that is because most metaphysical theories are ontotheological. By ontotheological, Heidegger means that the history of Western thought have failed to interrogate the question of being as being. But in the process of doing the question of being, they usually draft God into it. And it is for this reason that most of them feel that some of the metaphysical laws and principles that guide other things, other beings, do not apply to God. And that is why a scholar such as Alfred Whitehead claims that God is not an entity that is used or invoked to save metaphysical systems from collapse. God is a chief exemplification of metaphysical theories. So this makes me a very big fan of Ada Agada's work, because I'm one of those who believe that the question of being can be pursued aside bringing God into the framework. And one important thing, again, to understand about Ada Agada's work is that he's able to transcend the universalism, particularism divide, as briefly espoused by Professor Van Norden. You know, in the history of African philosophy, there's always been a contention over how we can make something that is African, that is indigenously African, relevant to the world. So this tension has been there. But when you take a look at Agada's philosophy or metaphysics of terror, you see how he's able to transcend this divide. He's able to foray into his indigenous Idoma culture, consider the various ways that they think, criticize, synthesize, and then bring this idea in terms of how scholars such as Leopold Senghor, Mogobe Ramose, Innocent Asuzu, and Jonathan Chimakunam have discussed the idea of African philosophy and being. And so he is able to bring all of this together to show how unique his idea on metaphysics of terror is. So the work definitely transcends the divide between the universalism and the particularist idea of African ideas and philosophy. So following all these, I think I have been able to show that Ada Agada's work has come at the right time. It is one that shows that at least there is originality on the part of emerging African scholars, and that we are ready to take the bull by the horn and show that African philosophy is no longer a push aside. In spite of all of this, I think I find about 5 problems that are replete in the work. The first problem has to do with the idea of logic. I am writing my doctoral thesis on African ontology and logic. During the course of my studies, I came across Susan Stebbing, and her words have had an overriding influence in my scholarship, because she says that for you to understand the history of Western thought, you must first of all be immersed in Aristotle's logic. And when you talk about logic, the first question, nobody even asks anything. The first thing that comes to your mind is two-value, bivalent classical logic, 3 laws of thought, and that is it. So if Susan Stebbing is saying, for you to understand the history of Western ideas, you must first of all immerse yourself in classical logic, then I asked myself, what kind of logic do you need to understand African or the history of African thought? You see, it is important for us to have a background logic, which Chimakunam talks about in his 2019 book, Izumezu, where he talks about the need of a logic criterion to make African ideas indigenous and original, but universalizable as well. During the course of Professor Norden's talk, he mentioned the work of Placide Tempels. And Tempels, yes, he was able to decode the overriding influence or ontology of events in the Bantu. But because of the kind of logic that gets Tempels' language, he was not able to capture the idea that something can be and not be at the same time. He was not able to capture the fact that being can be becoming. And so as a result of that, there was a lot of confusion regarding the presentation of that work. So in this case, I think Ada Agada's work suffers from my own perspective because he has not been able to articulate clearly the kind of logic that undergirds his system. And I say this not because he is ignorant of this, but because in 2019, during the when Chimakunam published his Izumezu logic, Chimakunam was able to apply his 3-valued Izumezu logic to Ada Agada's philosophy of consolation. So I was thinking that with a new review, a CSP scholar, for we have talked about this over and over, both in the group and both individually, he has to create a chapter where he discusses the logic or mentions the kind of logic that undergirds his thought. And this is going to assist people to, first of all, be immersed in the kind of logic that will make them to understand this unique idea rather than misrepresenting this idea or distorting it. So I feel that is one of the fallouts that I find in the work. The second fallout has to do with the idea of proto-panpsychism and what I support in pan-experientialism. Proto-panpsychism is Ada Agada's another word for the idea of mood. Proto-panpsychism is taken from proto and panpsychism. And panpsychism means that mind is ubiquitous in everything. That is, everything has a mind. And this mind is primordial to even God. That is why he says he's talking about the doctrine of proto-panpsychism. So if mind is primordial, and if mind is endemic in all things, then Agada feels that he has been able to solve the problem, the mind-body problem that has so much bothered the mainstream and dominant philosophers in the Western world. But a cautious look at proto-panpsychism for me, I think it's too much of a wishful thinking, because I believe that pan-experientialism would have been a better word. Pan-experientialism says that all things have experiences. There's no way we can actually establish how things can have minds. Of course, we always do this as human beings from our anthropocentric perspective. We always want to project what we think is the case on other animals, both higher and lower than us by our standards, of course. So I think it's just so much to say all things have minds. Why not don't we just say that all things have experiences? I think that's a safer way of looking at it. So that's the second point that I find in the Agada's book. The third problem that I discern from the work has to do with the problem of cosmogony. In the course of his work, Agada places so much emphasis on trying to talk about what was before God, after considering the theories of teleology, mechanism, evolutionary theories, and all. He subscribes to a version of idea that makes him to provide a cosmogony. But I think, again, that this is too much of a wishful thinking, because there's no one that was there. All we're going to have are speculative theories. If you take my pan-experientialism seriously, for instance, then you realize that if everything has experiences, there was no one to have experienced what was. Why bother ourselves with so much of a cosmogony when we don't even have the right brain? Our brains do not even, as scientists and neurosurgeons and neurologists have said, our brains do not even have the capacity to capture reality. And we want to go so far, so back into what was before. Look at the gap between the first Homo sapiens and some of the dinosaurs and animals that we had. But we humans want to stand and we want to legislate and even talk about what the world was before anything was created and all. So I think personally that Agada's doctrine of cosmogony is something that will always be speculative. It doesn't really add anything to what is at the moment. The fourth fallout I find in the work has to do with the issue of God as a male. In the course of his work, Agada refers to God as a he. Again, this goes back to experience. Based on what experience have we come to realize that God is a he? Most of us reveal books and literatures concerning God in the Abrahamic monotheisms and other non-popular dominant religions have always seen God as a male. So why don't we use a it for God, or God as such, that we cannot actually conclude that God is a male, unless, of course, we want to be hegemonic, and that is what the feminists are always fighting over. So I think that is too much of a thing for someone who hasn't seen God, who is trying to talk about how the world began in his philosophy of terror, to talk about God as a male. These are speculative thinking that do not have objective backup and empirical evidence for them. The last part of the fifth objection or fallout I have with that work has to do with the third part of the work, where Ada Agada has tried to display his intellectual and analytical flair by comparing African or his own philosophy of terror with top-notch Western ideas. And he christened that part comparative philosophy. And in the course of trying to tell us about what that part of the book is about, Agada makes some ideological blunders. And one of them has to do with his failure to understand the ideology that undergirds comparative and intercultural philosophy. They may look alike, but they are not the same. So I was aghast when I read Agada saying that in the course of this comparison, he is going to take comparative philosophy and intercultural philosophy as the same. Of course, they are not the same. I say this because when you talk about comparative philosophy, you are bringing any other kind of philosophy against a particular philosophy that is seen to be the standard, the yardstick that other kinds of philosophies must measure to. When you when you take courses like comparative philosophy, African and Western, it's always a case of the Westerners have given this solution to mind-body problem. So what kind of solutions have Africans given? You see, we don't even want to understand the kind of background that informed the African belief about mind, body, but we just want to hurry up and show, oh, the West have this version of it, we also have this version of it. The West have this version of that, we also have that version of that. So in that case, originality is stifled. We have a very serious problem with comparative philosophy. But when you're talking about intercultural philosophy, this is a cautious avenue, a cautious and conscious avenue where you place two independent philosophies side by side, irrespective of which one is better than which one. You try to explore the, what do you call that, phenomenological epoche by Hedman Ursel. You try to employ that and try to see that, okay, let's put these two philosophies side by side and try to see which one is better, which one is more applicable, which one is much more better and adequate for use in the world. So I think intercultural philosophy is something that is much more better than comparative philosophy in terms of the epistemic marginalization and just injustice that African philosophy has suffered over time. So I think that Ada Agada should make an effort to stop that comparison that comparative philosophy and intercultural philosophies are the same. Unfortunately, they are not the same. And that is one of the greatest weaknesses of the work as expressed in the third part of the book and the last 3 chapters of that work. So I have been able to provide these problems because one of the greatest images you can paint with a philosopher is to criticize their ideas. And when you criticize these ideas, make sure that you do not distort them. Make sure you have available evidences, quote them. And I would have loved to do that. But of course, I have tried to see how I can pass my criticisms to him personally to respond to. But I've brought this also to the front of the world to change that penchant view that members of the CSP do not criticize one another. Of course, that is not true. Nevertheless, I must return to commend Dr. Ada Agada for this great work. I am one of his fans. I love the work, and I recommend that for everybody who wants to understand originality in contemporary academic of African philosophy. I think this is one work that has created a very, very, very big leap for African philosophy. And I enjoin anyone who wants to major in African ontology to not pass this work by. So based on this, I'd like to stop here and see what happens next. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to speak to some questions that might come forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ofuasia. Mr. Ofuasia has shown that he's a member of the Conversational Society of Philosophy by really situating himself as the one Jew of this discussion, you know, giving hard-hitting critique on Dr. Agada's very, very interesting work. Yes, his book is very important, and I must say, for me personally, the main reason I got into African metaphysics was reading Dr. Agada's 2015 book, which I still think is one of his best published materials he has come up with. I'm yet to finish his new book. I'll finish it very soon, but I still hold on to that thinking. But thank you very much, Mr. Ofuasia, for your critique. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure that Dr. Agada will take it into strides and to help him, you know, improve some of the deficient areas in his philosophy as he moves on with the idea he's proposing. So thank you very much. So I'd like to call on our next speaker, Dr. Mottamai Molefe. But before I do that again, I would like to very briefly introduce him. Dr. Molefe is a senior researcher at the Center for Leadership Ethics at the University of Ofuasia. He specializes in African philosophy, applied ethics, bioethics, animal ethics. He specializes in moral philosophy, social and political philosophy. He is the author of An African Philosophy of Personhood, Morality, and Politics, and African Personhood and Applied Ethics. So thank you very much, Dr. Molefe, for agreeing to be here. Please, I welcome you to give your talk.
Thanks a lot, colleague. Just a moment. Thank you. I feel honored to be in the presence of esteemed and respected colleagues, and I really appreciate being invited to reflect in the work of Dr. Agada, who is really in modern African philosophy is making such great contributions. Mine really is not much, but to really celebrate such brilliant work, such creativity that we see with our eyes in this time. I must congratulate, and I must also further encourage Dr. Agada to keep bringing such intellectual treasures to our attention. I've not yet finished the book, but I must say it's a very original book, well thought, and the articulation is impressive. Very challenging ideas, and the originality of thought cannot be overemphasized. Given that the book, for me, it's above my intellect, I've just decided to focus on one small element of the book. One of the major claims, and I suppose is the claim that really holds the very essence of the concept of consolationism. It's the claim that revolves around how to think about perfection. And the claim seems to be that perfection is impossible. Perfection is impossible. And I suppose it is because of the claim that perfection is impossible that we find the concept of consolation, or the theory of consolationism being proposed to us. So the implication of that is that if it is true that perfectionism is impossible, then surely we are in a pitiable state, pursuing the unachievable, and therefore consolation or even pity seems to be our permanent state. But if it is possible that perfection is attainable, it seems then it might be a good way to really problematize commitments to something like consolationism. And I'm thinking this problematization, I don't think it's trivial. I think it's significant, given that the kind of consolation imagined here is such that it is premised precisely on the unattainability of perfection. Right? And the way it's framed, is that human life really is a life that is activated by yearning. The concept of yearning is very central here. And this yearning is a yearning towards, that is informed by the purposive nature of our existence, at least if you focus on human beings. And the goal, the telos of the purpose is this perfection. But the tragedy is that we have a nature that is geared toward perfection, but the world as it is, metaphysically speaking, even our nature as it is, it's such that we can't achieve this perfection. For my part, I think I just want to explore that thought, and I want to make my admission. I'm not a metaphysician, so I'm not going to enter through metaphysics. I'll leave that for those who are competent in that regard. I tend to focus on ethics. I want to then raise this issue from an ethical dimension. And I'm doing this also because Dr. Agada does touch on ethical dimensions when he draws on the concept of vitality when he uses the notion of liberty. Liberty, our ability to make choices, and we make those choices so that we can achieve perfection. But alas, we find ourselves that even in the pursuit of liberty, you know, we are unable to reach perfection. And I just want to raise a small issue, which I think might help us to think about my suggestion that maybe perfection is possible. And the issue is, how do we think about perfection or perfectionism? How do we think about perfection and perfectionism? And when we think about perfection and perfectionism, what is the scope? What is the scope of perfection and perfectionism? Those are two issues that I want us to think about. How to think about perfection, and within the moral frame, within the moral context, and also the scope of perfection. And so in the very first instance, in moral philosophy, when philosophers think of perfection, starting from Aristotle to modern perfectionists like Thomas Hooker, and people like myself who work with the concept of personhood, which I interpret as a perfectionist concept. So one of the things that we think of perfection in relation to a natural kind, right? So human beings are an instance of a natural kind. Human beings are a natural kind. And to associate perfection and have a theory of perfectionism, we then say, we identify what we may want to classify as essential characteristics of that natural kind. And it is the development of those essential characteristics. When those characteristics are developed, or they are nurtured, or they are properly exercised, then a being has achieved a perfection. And then in this sense, perfection is a final good. Perfection is a final good. So I think a natural kind is born with certain essential capacities, inborn equipment. And the development of that equipment results, if the story goes positively, results in perfection. So it's just a typical story of perfectionism. And obviously, I'm being very rough here. I'm just giving you a sketch of what perfectionism is about. So if you take human beings, if you think of what is essential about human beings, is the rational part of the soul, as Aristotle will put it. A human being who develops these capacities and has these capacities developed, then it's going to be a being that has reached perfection. Right. So roughly, that's the story. Or another way to think about it, then I could give you 3 theories to think about perfection in this sense. So you can take the Christian view. Human beings are created in the image of God, and the image of God, if you follow Aquinas, is the rational part of humanity. If you develop that rational part of humanity, then you're participating in divinity, then you're participating in perfection, then you're perfecting your nature, imago Dei, right? Developing your divine nature. Or if you take capacity for virtue, as I argue in my work, you develop that capacity, then you achieve personhood or perfection, personhood or perfection, then you've perfected yourself. Or if you take vitality, if you develop this vitality, as scholars, you develop this vitality, then your nature becomes loaded with positive dispositions, which are usually expressed in terms of virtues. Then you've perfected yourself. So there are different ways. The different scholars will identify different things as what counts as essential, right? And then they account for perfection in terms of the development of these capacities, right? So development of these capacities. And then a moral concept like liberty will come in. You need that space, you need that political space to be able to achieve those, right? And then there are going to be a lot of constraints, but all things being equal, the development of these capacities amounts to perfection, right? So that's roughly a definition of perfection in moral philosophy. Then there's a second question. The question of the scope of this. How perfect must you be for us to think that you're perfect? Right, how perfect must you be? My perfection is that I think Dr. Agada is working with a very extreme view of perfection. He's very extreme view of perfection. My suggestion is that our scope of perfection must be determined by the natural kinds that we're dealing with, and the kind of world that we live in. Then we measure perfection in terms of that. And I'm suggesting that Dr. Agada is working with an extreme view of perfection. If you just go on PDF and type the word maximization, you'll see that the kind of perfection that he has in mind, right? When he talks about vitality, he talks about, he says, human beings, they come into the world and they exit the world. This is page 85, without maximizing a vital force. So for him, perfection is when you actually maximize. In other words, you reach the best possible state of your nature, right? In other words, if you could quantify vitality to up to 100, you are perfect if you reach 100. If you don't reach 100, you're not perfect, right? So that's the implication of the language of maximization, right? And very important, the language, and Dr. Agada uses the language of maximization, right? And if you set the standard at maximization, you might be working with a view that doesn't properly understand the kinds of natural things, the natural kinds of things that we are, and the constraints and the limitations inherent in our nature, right? And moreover, you might be expecting too much from human beings, right? You might be expecting too much from human beings, given the constraints and all other considerations, right? But if you're reading, he talks about an ability to maximize. He talks about moment-to-moment maximization. A failure from our moment-to-moment living, moving from one point to another, we cannot maximize, right? And so the way he thinks about perfection, he uses the language of maximization. He uses the language of philosophy. We draw a distinction between two ways to think about value. Right? There are moral theories that want to promote a value, how to relate to the value of honesty. There are at least two ways to relate to it. On the one hand, we could promote this value. On the other hand, we could honor this value. Theories that require us to promote a value, usually associated with consequentialism, but you need to optimize, you need to maximize, make sure that there is much of that value as possible, right? So in relation to honesty, these are some of the implications. In relation to honesty, you must do anything possible for you to evince or to display this value, right? If it means, if by being dishonest once, there's going to be more honest in the world. If I'm pursuing maximization, I'm required to be dishonest once to my partner or at work so that there's more honesty in the world. The idea is maximization, right? If you're honoring a value, on the other hand, you are required to be true to the instance of that value, even if being truthful at that moment will produce undesirable consequences, right? If by being honest to my wife, for example, is going to make me boring and will lead to more dishonesty on a part, I must continue being honest because I'm honoring a value, right? These two ways to think about it. If you then interpret the kind of idea that Dr. Agada has in mind, it seems to me that he's inclined toward the moral system that wants us to maximize values, and that's how he thinks of perfectionism. So, if you locate this within the moral philosophy, it's going to have a very problematic implication in that regard. But moreover, my concern in this particular instance, it is not necessary that when we think of perfection, we want to adopt a maximizing logic, moral logic. We can adopt an axiology, a moral system that doesn't require us to maximize, but that requires us, the language that philosophers use, that requires us at the very least not to maximize, but to satisfy, to do enough, given the constraints of the kinds of things we are, the constraints of the world that we are in. Then if you are satisficing, we can meaningfully imagine a system that says perfection is possible. So my suggestion my suggestion approached from a moral point of view is that maybe Dr. Agada is hasty to give up on perfection. If he takes very modest and moderate approaches to think about perfection, like the ones that respect, that takes into account the kinds of things we are, the kind of the world we're in, and say, do enough in that world. Enjoy the little pleasures that you can have. Enjoy the joys. If you can run, and enjoy the running. If you can see to that dimension, see to that dimension. Perfection within that satisfying scope is possible. So I think that's a small critique that I think I wanted to bring to Consolationism. Instead of resigning ourselves to a state of looking ourselves pitiably as living a condition of consolation, I'm suggesting that we could up the game a little bit. Instead of maximizing, let us satisfy, do the best within the limited conditions, existential conditions we find. So perfection might be possible, I think.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Molefe. You touched on a very important aspect of Dr. Agada's work, and from an interestingly moral perspective, which I don't think I've come across yet in reference to Dr. Agada's work. Personally, I've had many arguments with, I've been privileged to have many arguments with Dr. Agada on his idea of perfection, which I don't agree with, because unlike him, I'm a stronger pessimist, and I do not think this world is geared towards perfection in the first place. I mean, if you look around the world, it doesn't seem to me that there is anything, any pointer to the fact that the world is pursuing perfection. If anything, it's pursuing chaos. So we've always had this argument. But it's interesting you come from a moral perspective, and I'm sure it's something that Dr. Agada would really consider going forwad. So without much ado, thank you guys for your contributions. I would now like to call on Dr. Ada Agada to respond to your reviews, to respond to your comments, your criticisms, and all that. I would also ask members of the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box so that Dr. Agada can read and then respond to it later on if you want to ask questions and all that. So I would now like to very much welcome Dr. Agada to, respond and, give us his own take on his work. Dr. Agada, thank you.
Okay, this is Dr. Ada Agada. May I start by first thanking Professor Bryan Van Norden for his well-received reviews, as well as Dr. Molefe and Mr. Ofuasia for their insightful discussions and comments of my book. The book under discussion, Consolationism and Comparative African Philosophy, is actually a follow-up of my first book, Existence and Consolation. But there are, of course, substantial differences. Sitting down to reread my first book, Existence and Consolation, I was struck by its incompleteness, the imperfection, the lack of clarity of significant concepts, and the general kind of poetic use of language. It
Or I think Dr. Agada has some network issues. I'll try to help him reconnect. While we are waiting for Dr. Agada to reconnect, is anyone in the audience who has any question or comments for any of our speakers while we wait for Ada? I think he's coming back in now. Let's see if it's... Okay, I think Dr. Agada is into the room. I'll now wait for him to speak. Yeah.
Okay. So I will continue from where I stopped. I'm sorry for the interruption. It was a network issue that brought up accidental. So, you're hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You're hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you, Dr. Agada.
Okay, I will continue from where I stopped. So the motivation for writing my book then was to situate consolationism in African philosophy and I carve a place for it in the context of global philosophy. So the book has now been born, and I'm very glad that it has attracted the attention that it has this evening with Professor Bryan Norden's comment review, Molefe's insightful comments, as well as Ofuasia's discussion. This said, I will now be willing to take your questions. So I will read out the questions aloud and then respond to them.
Okay, so there is a question from Bryan. I don't know if you see Dr. Agada.
I will start with Professor Bryan Van Norden's questions. Professor Bryan Van Norden asked if understanding consolation. Okay, so Professor Bryan Van Norden is asking, would it be accurate to describe consolation as taking joy in one's limitation by genuine role in the unending process of striving for perfection? Indeed, this is very correct and very apt. It captures a sentiment of the maximization, the quest for the maximization of the emotion of joy. Now, this genuine role, the genuine role that Professor Bryan Norden is referring to is the capacities, the various capacities we find ourselves in our everyday life as students, as lecturers, as Jews, all these capacities, and as we harmonize our selfish interests, our self-centered interests with the interests of our fellow beings, this is a genuine role that we play in the knowledge that although the universe is ultimately pointless, since we cannot see the points from the standpoint of human life, nevertheless, we are capable of creating meanings. We create drops of meanings in this ocean of meaninglessness. In playing this role, the genuineness, which I repeat, consists of harmonizing our selfish interest with the interests of our fellow human beings. In playing this role, we derive a kind of intellectual and emotional satisfaction, which comes under the category of consolation. So I think that Bryan Van Norden got it perfectly. I actually learned a thing or two from this apt description of the term consolation. Very simplified. I also want to take note of something Molefe said. Molefe contextualized, Dr. Molefe contextualized my thoughts within Afro-communitarianism. an aspect of African philosophy where he has excelled. He noted that my version of perfection might be too utopic, or will I say metaphysical and cosmic. He said that being perfect simply consists in being the best versions of ourselves. I concede a point to him, but to what extent can being the best versions of ourselves, to what extent removing all harm the record? It is possible for some individuals, say Jesus Christ, the Buddha, it is possible to say that they might have attained these best versions of themselves, and in fact must have attained perfection. But the evidence, the daily evidence of moral evil in the world that we see every day kind of entrench a pessimism about whether we are capable of improving the world at all. So being the best versions of ourselves may amount in the final analysis to a drop of water in an ocean of futility. Nevertheless, as we strive to become the best version of ourselves and derive the consolation which I've been talking about, we can then see we get a better world, but always in the knowledge that ultimately everything is meaningless. So I think that the idea of perfection, striving for perfection, remains intact, despite Molefe's criticism from the perspective of African personhood. It is too little, too late. There's another question. What is the point of consolation? One death and nothingness still awaits us all in the end, because we are beings of consolation. If you suggest that you commit suicide, that in itself is still futile. It's as futile as our knowledge that the universe may be ultimately pointless and meaningless. But as I've always reminded us, joy is real. It's as real as anything can be, as real as our minds, as our experiences. The very fact that we come into existence, we come into being, we are able to seek consolation in playing our genuine roles in this world. We are able to find joy in this life, this amount of consolation. It may not be so much. We know that in the end, death awaits us. But in pursuing the moment-to-moment maximization of the emotion of joy, we derive something real, something with a positive value, which for that instant that it endures, enables us to create more meanings, at least drops of meanings in the ocean of meaninglessness. I believe that this joy is relevant and significant to the extent that it entrenches moments of meaning, which makes our life more worth living. So I think the fact that death ultimately awaits us does not nullify the fact, the validity and value of consolation, of joy. It is a reality in our lives, and it helps us to cope with the tragic dimensions of our everyday existence. So joy is real, and the reality of death, ultimate reality of death, does not cancel out its value. Okay, I will respond to Ofuasia's critic. Ofuasia has noted that my idea of proto-panpsychism contains some inconsistency. Now, proto-panpsychism is a model, the exploitative model within which I articulated the doctrine of modes. So it is panpsychist, a kind of moderate panpsychist, Instead of me reducing all the phenomena of the world to consciousness, which amounts to a strong kind of panpsychism, I posited a fundamental principle of the universe, which is a mind-body event. So by positing mind-body as primordial, I'm now able to account for the fact of mental and material or physical phenomena in the world. Ofuasia is saying that the implication of proto-panpsychism is that all things in the universe have minds, e.g., not only human beings, but also animals. Animals and also apparently inanimate things like stones, mountains, etc. He suggests that a more appropriate term would be pan-experientialism. But the way Ofuasia has coached the idea of pan-experientialism does not clash in any substantial way with my idea of proto-panpsychism. For us to talk of pan-experientialism, we are saying that everything in the universe involves an experience. But if we are not talking about everything in the universe involving experience, we are also automatically saying that mind is fundamental, either now actual or potential. For there to be an experience, there must be something that perceives it. There must be a mind. So since the concept of experience implies the reality of a mind, I do not see any tension between the concept of pan-experientialism as well as the concept of proto-panpsychism. They are one and the same thing. My point is that mind, there is mind in the universe. It is there now, either actual, as in the case of the human being, or potential, as the case of inanimate things. So what happens is that the seemingly inanimate is capable of developing mind. When the right conditions are available, they cannot agglomerate and evolve minds. Of course, it is still another question. What brings about the emergence of mind? You might talk about God, or you might talk about natural mechanism. But at the moment, it would be rather cumbersome for me to digress into this point. My point now is that mind is either actual in the universe or potential. In this case, pan-experientialism is no more different from proto-panpsychism. There's another question. Is it advisable to opt out of meanings, things that doesn't give joy? Well, no. We already know that sadness is a reality, but it is in the nature of human beings to move away, run away from sadness. What engenders or entrenches pessimism, and to move towards those things that gives us joy. But sadness is inevitable. Since it is inevitable, our conscious effort to move away from sadness, to overcome the conditions that create sadness, and move towards those conditions that enables us to achieve joy, in doing this we derive consolation. So why we cannot avoid sadness in the world? It is in our capacity to move away from it and to consciously strive towards joy. In fact, the embrace, the acceptance of the tragic state of affairs is a kind of consolation, since it is a large part for us to seek to ameliorate the negative conditions that sadness creates. So there's a dialectics of sadness and joy. Sadness is always an indication of the importance of joy. So even in our sadness, we are still capable of consolation in consciously choosing to pursue joy. There's yet another question. How does the transient joy compensate reasonably for the enduring grief in the world? Do we accept this joy as consolation for a situation we cannot better? If we cannot better our situation in life, how is transient joy a consolation? It is a consolation for the periods that it persists. We may say that an everlasting joy, which I equate with happiness, is what we desire. But this will amount to attaining perfection, and we are not perfect. In fact, I sometimes equate perfection with happiness. That is everlasting joy. We know that this is not possible. So we accept our limitation, recognize the impossibility of attaining happiness or everlasting joy or continuous joy, prolonged joy. In understanding this limitation, we embrace the moment's mercies, the moment's meaning. I believe that every meaning that conduces to our joy should be embraced, while we stoically face the gloom, the tragic dimension of the world. So this all calls for stoicism, calls for what Albert Camus calls revolts, the determination to face the world, to endure the sad moments while striving towards the achievement of those conditions that conduces to our joys. There's yet another question. Is comparative philosophy the same as intercultural philosophy? What kind of logic undergirds your ontology? Okay, someone is asking whether comparative philosophy is the same as intercultural philosophy. In my opinion, they are equivalent to each other. To talk about comparative philosophy is to talk about comparison and contrast, setting ideas side by side together and seeing how they are similar or different. Also, to talk about intercultural philosophy is to talk about not simply diversity of cultures, not simply what is different or similar about cultures, but also to set side by side concepts taken from these cultures to see to the extent that they are different and to the extent that they are also similar. So whenever we talk about philosophy and we remove concepts, I do not think we are still discussing philosophy, but rather ethnography, ethnology, and anthropology. Since intercultural philosophy involves selecting or identifying philosophic concept in a particular culture and setting it against another concept taken from another culture, it's time to reason that intercultural philosophy is, in fact, either comparative philosophy or a kind of comparative philosophy. Only that here, cultures are involved rather than merely traditions. We may compare Heidegger and say Bertrand Russell. We are talking of comparative philosophy, comparing two philosophers from the same tradition or culture. We could also talk about Molefe and another philosopher from, say, from the West or China. We are not only talking about intercultural philosophy, but also comparative philosophy. So I think the grounds of equivalence is justified. Now to the other question. What sort of logic undergirds your ontology? The sort of logic that undergirds the ontology of consolation is a complementaristic logic, which African philosophy exhibited and which Chima has so brilliantly formalized in what he called Ezumezu logic. So it is a logic of complementation, a logic of inclusion that seeks to bring both the truths and force city variables into a conversation in the what Chimakuna comes the complemented phase. So we can see that Aristotelian logic is not rejected, but space is created for a complementaristic interactionist logic, which enables us to expand horizons and includes as many variables as are possible in the creation of a whole and a system. Is there any other question?
No.
All right. May I use the opportunity to thank everybody who have honored my invitation and participated in this book presentation. In particular, Van Norden, Molefe, Ofuasia, and Atu. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agada, for your wonderful responses to our speakers, our reviewers and discussants. Thank you very much. You inspire us to, be original in our thinking and to do African philosophy the proper way. I see some people have their hands up, but unfortunately, we may not be able to take your questions because of time. We originally planned to have this meeting for an hour, 30 minutes. And so perhaps Dr. Molefe can perhaps email Dr. Agada any questions he has for him. But before we go, I would like to ask, does anyone have a comment rather than a question, regards to the book or Agada's philosophy or anything that you may have heard from our speakers? I see Amara's hand is up. I'll come back to Dr. Molefe if he still wants to speak. So very briefly, Amara, your comment. Ms. Amara, are you there? I think you're muted.
Oh my God. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I actually said I had a question, but I can turn it to a comment. I'm feeling that Ada Agada's idea of consolationism, where he says that we should accept, find consolation in accepting the tragic things of our life. I'm thinking that such an idea will lead us to what can be called the Pollyanna Syndrome, trying to be too optimistic about life. And I feel that poses a very great challenge to our existence and how we really find meaning in our lives. I'm thinking that you should just look at that aspect, how this idea of finding consolation in the tragic things of life, how it will lead us to having this Pollyanna syndrome, where we always think that good things will always come out of bad things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amara, for that comment. Very quickly, Dr. Molefe, sorry I cut you short with Dr. Agada's disability. To be hard for him to hear you, so it's always better to type in your questions. That's why we ask for people to type in their questions, but you can still make your comments and questions, and perhaps later on he can respond to you if you still want to do that, Dr. Molefe.
No, look, I had a question, but look, I want to say it's really encouraging to see works like that of Dr. Agada. And for me, as an African, I can say this is one of the proud moments for us, where we see one amongst ourselves emerging such creativity, such clarity, such a beautiful writing. And I'm really, really hoping that we could pause really and celebrate this moment. I'm not an expert on the system building that the work of Dr. Agada is doing, but to see such intellectual courage for a man to say, man, I want to develop a system, I think it's something that is worth taking a pause and really appreciating. So mine was to say, keep going, Dr. Agada. Please pioneer way for emerging young scholars in the continent and also globally to say that it is possible. And also to really appreciate and encourage young people. If I'm just hearing from Dr. Ribia that Dr. Agada has got certain physical challenges, but for him to console himself by producing the system of consolationism, it's equally praiseworthy and admirable. I just wanted to say that, look, I've started reading the book, I've gone through the book, I'm enjoying the book. Let's appreciate this work. And colleagues, wherever we are in the continent and in the world, we should start teaching this material to reveal different minds to our students so that we give this life the mileage, this work, the mileage that it deserves. Congratulations, Dr. Agada, and thanks for the organizers, to the organizers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Molefe. That was very, very inspiring. I think what you say is very, very important, but let me not waste too much time. Let me give Nelson. Nelson will be the last person to comment before I round up, because our time is very fast spent. So Nelson, okay. If you could please briefly make your comments, and then we'll close.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And very briefly, straight to my comment, which was supposed to be a question. Please permit me, Dr. Agada, to draw attention to your idea of the doctrine of mood, which you had more or less colored your consolationist philosophy. Now, in the first book, I will also draw attention from the first book, since this is a follow-up from the first book. In the first book, in your idea, in your explication of the doctrine of mood, you argued that the 21st century man is a melancholic man, and that there are two faces or two spheres. He oscillates between two spheres, which is joy and sadness. With that, you talked about your doctrine of mood. And also, Dr. Chimakonam, in his introduction to that your book, he argued that this doctrine of mood, according to Chimakonam, becomes the only option that after, since one cannot be able to fulfill his joy or sadness, he's been overwhelmed by consolation. Now, I'm more or less, it's a comment and it's also a question. It appears to my mind that consolationism is like a dead end. At the point of throwing in the towel, a state of helplessness, or call it an elastic limit in which nothing further can be maintained or achieved. If that is the case, I think you may need to rethink the idea of consolationism, because in my own thinking, I think the 21st century man is not just a melancholic man, a melancholy man in terms of temperament, but one who oscillates between the two. He is is an individual that tries as much as possible to find meaning out of sadness or from joy. And in that sense, he is full of resilience. What I'm saying in essence is that the word consolationism, can't it be a kind of rephrased or recasted to mean resilience? Resilience in the sense that despite you are trying to pursue joy, but your joy is short-lived, you should be resilient about it. I don't know if my thoughts are clear enough, but I'm thinking towards the sense of resilience rather than consolation, because the word consolation seems like one throwing in the towel, just agreeing to fate, and then because he's a melancholic man, he just takes things as it comes, whether in a bit to strive for success or for joy, he's being short-lived in that joy. He therefore consoles himself in that sense. So I don't know if something can be done, or maybe you can think about it. I'm just trying to make an observation in that sense. I believe when I try to do some work on that area, we pass on the writings to you so that you can see what to do about it. I don't know if you get me.
Yes, thank you very much, Nelson, for your comments through question. It's an interesting point you make. I think I can even respond to your comments. I think, at least from my reading of Dr. Agada's work, he does capture moments of meaning in his work. He calls it joy. And of course, this is in contrast to sadness, which points to the futility of existence, especially human existence, which is obviously our primary concern. So while he captures moments of meaning or moments of joy in his philosophy, he is not unaware of the ultimate futility of the universe's attempt at perfection. And it is this inevitable futility that leads him to his consolation. So I think, yes, you are right in some of the comments you make, but he did capture these moments of meaning you're talking about. It is just that it all ends in futility. And so we need consolation rather than resilience, which is what you're proposing, at least from his philosophical perspective. That's from my reading of his work. I'm sure when you articulate your ideas in, say, a rejoinder or a paper or an article or a review or something of that nature, Dr. Agada will be very well able to respond more clearly than I have to your concerns and your questions. So thank you very much, Nelson, for that comments. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our speakers. Professor Bryan Van Norden, thank you for accepting to be a part of this event. Thank you, Dr. Molefe, for agreeing to be a part of this event. Also, thank you, Emmanuel Ofuasia, for taking time out to provide us with your very, very interesting critique of Dr. Agada's work. I'm sure he really appreciates what you all have done. Dr. Molefe said something interesting. It is time for African philosophers to begin to, project their own original ideas and their original thinking and present it to the world. And really, that is what we are doing at the Conversational Society of Philosophy. But more important, not even much more important than that, is the second thing Dr. Molefe said, which boils down to what we've been saying for a while now, which is that African philosophers should begin to interact with one another more intently, to have conversations with each other, to read each other's work, and more importantly, to criticize the works of other contemporary African philosophers. We do not need to, always dig up the dead, old ancient philosophers. When young contemporary African philosophers are picking up newer ideas, that will move the discipline forward. So it's important for us to converse with ourselves, converse with our ideas, to teach each other, to teach our ideas, as Dr. Molefe has said. And this is what I'll leave you guys with, I'll leave everyone with, is that we should try as much as possible to, beyond presenting our own ideas as African philosophers, to also interact as African scholars, to criticize ourselves, to teach ourselves, and so on and so forth. So that is what I'll leave it with. That's what we've been doing in the conversational school. Like in this book launch, we've been able to gather scholars to talk about a certain philosopher's work. We hope to continue to do so, and we're enjoying other African scholars, even scholars from outside Africa who are interested in African philosophy, to check out contemporary African philosophers, their views, their ideas, and interact with them. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking our time to be here. Thank you very much. We hope to see you again in our next event. Thank you so much for being here. Goodbye.